Okay, in this recording, this video, we're going to talk about John Stuart Mill. And John Stuart Mill, I classify him partly as an academic hero. There were things about him that I admire, but as I studied him more, I came to also see him as a villain, kind of like Voltaire. He has strong positive and strong negative qualities. Okay, so John Stuart Mill lived from 1806 to 1873. He was an Englishman. He was a Protestant. He was really a Protestant atheist, and that's a unique category, but it does truly exist. That idea of an atheist and a Christian atheist, but especially a Protestant English atheist. It's going to be highly relevant. Mill started learning Greek when he was only 3 years old. His father really wanted for him to have a classical education. He started learning Latin when he was 8 years old. I think that learning Latin as a young guy also had an effect on him. He eventually became a member of Parliament in England. And here's a quote from John Stuart Mill about individuality. Those only are happy who have minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness, on the happiness of others, on the improvement of mankind, even on some art or pursuit followed not as a means, but as itself an ideal end. Aiming thus at something else, they find happiness along the way. So that was actually a quote about happiness and just getting busy with a task, and that makes you happy rather than thinking about it. The individualism stuff is coming next. But you notice when you start studying all these quotes how there's a lot of overlap between the different authors, and quite often you'll find a lot of the best original stuff going all the way back to ancient Greece. But okay, so that's a nice quote by Mill on happiness. Now let's hear him talk about individualism. He who lets the world, or his own portion of it, choose his plan in life for him, has no need of any other faculty than the ape-like one of imitation. But he who chooses his plan for himself, he employs all his faculties. He must observe. He must use observation to see, reasoning and judgment to foresee, activity to gather materials for decision, discrimination to decide, and when he has decided, firmness and self-control to hold his deliberate decision. John Stuart Mill. So one of the things you'll notice is, like I said, he was a student of Latin, and I actually think studying Latin seems to worsen people's ability to write. Look at John Milton, for example, okay? Brilliant ideas, but his writing style, kind of awkward. I'm just going to show you one contrasting quote with Kierkegaard saying almost the same thing about the importance of seeking one's own individual self and identity for a contrast in the emotional contact, and then we'll get back to John Stuart Mill. Okay, so this is Soren Kierkegaard. He lived from 1813 to 1855. He was called the Danish Socrates, talking about the importance of establishing one's own individual identity. Self-creation is the ultimate task of man. You don't just think your way through a philosophic problem, you feel your way through it. Possibility means I can, and it is convenient to say that possibility turns into actuality, but it is not so easy. There is an intermediate step called anxiety. Anxiety arises from awareness of having a variety of options and not being sure which is best. If a man were a beast or an angel, he would not be able to be in anxiety. However, because he is both beast and angel, he can be in anxiety. And the greater the anxiety, the greater the man. If we move forward, we have anxiety. If we do not move forward, we suffer the depression, the pressing down of the soul's purpose. In such a difficult choice, one must choose anxiety, for anxiety is at least the path of personal growth. Whereas depression is a stagnation and a defeat of life. Too much conformity drains away life. Individuality is like riding a wild stallion. Conformity is like falling asleep on a hay wagon. The person who is right often has to stand alone. To be able to despair is an advantage, for it implies that one has a self. The key factor is whether one is conscious of their despair. The more consciousness, the more intense the despair. But the more consciousness, the closer one is to eradicating the despair and living a genuine life appropriate for a human being. Soren Kierkegaard. That's very much, he's called the Danish Socrates. That's a long way of saying what Socrates said: the unexamined life is not worth living. Okay, back to John Stuart Mill. In this age, the mere example of nonconformity, the mere refusal to bend the knee to custom, is itself a service. Okay, so this is why I like John Stuart Mill. He talked about being an individual. He talked about developing your mind. He talked about standing up for things that are good and right and the benefit of freedom of thought and speech of the individual. All that is good. But I'm going to show you how John Stuart Mill kind of twisted things in his career a little bit, and that'll be highly relevant because you'll recognize a pattern with it. So we just have to build through this introduction of sort of the good developing aspect of John Stuart Mill. He continues, eccentricity has always abounded, when and where strength of character has abounded. And the amount of eccentricity in a society has generally been proportional to the amount of genius, mental vigor, and moral courage it contained. That so few dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of this time. Persons of genius are a small minority, but in order to have them, it is necessary to preserve the soil in which they grow. Genius can only breathe freely in an atmosphere of freedom. John Stuart Mill continues, the most incessant occupation of the human intellect throughout life is the ascertainment of truth. No one can be a great thinker who does not recognize that as a thinker, it is his first duty to follow his intellect to whatever conclusions it may lead. People think genius is a fine thing if it enables a man to write an exciting poem or to paint a picture, but in its true sense, that of originality in thought and action, though no one says that it is not a thing to be admired, nearly all, at heart, think they can do very well without it. Unhappily, this is too natural to be wondered at. Originality is one thing which unoriginal minds cannot feel the use of. How can great minds be produced in a country where the test of a great mind is that it agrees to the opinion of small minds? The study of science teaches young men to think, while the study of the classics teaches them to express thought. Yeah, that's actually a great statement that, you got to study science to learn science, but if you don't also study the classics and read a lot of books on other subjects, you end up not being able to think as well, not being able to write as well. You kind of become a predictable conformist chump. Okay, Mill continues. When one's ideas are not challenged, one's ability to defend them weakens. After the primary necessities of food and clothing, freedom is the first and strongest want of human nature. All ideas need to be heard because each idea contains one aspect of the truth. By examining that aspect, we add to our own idea of the truth. Even ideas that have no truth in them whatsoever are useful because by disproving them, we add support to our own ideas. There is nothing in which an untrained mind shows itself more hopelessly incapable than in drawing the proper general conclusions from its own experience. With small men, no great thing can be accomplished. The only freedom deserving of that name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, as long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs. Okay, so now we're working towards his utilitarianism, personal philosophy. And still a little bit more about a open debate, free speech, and top-notch thinking. Top-notch thinking has to be free. It's going to be wild, unpredictable, and nonconformist, and it's going to go places that are not commonly done. Mill continues, he who only knows his side of the case knows little of that. It is only through a clash of adverse opinions that the remainder of the truth has any chance of being supplied. The only way in which a human being can make some approach to knowing the whole of a subject is by hearing what can be said about it by persons of every variety of opinion, and studying all those modes in which it can be looked at by every character of mind. All ideas need to be heard, because each idea contains one aspect of the truth. By examining that aspect, we add to our own idea of the truth. Even ideas that have no truth in them whatsoever are useful. Okay? Every man who says frankly and fully what he thinks is doing a public service. We should be grateful to him for challenging our most cherished opinions. Everything must be free to be written and published without restraint. Okay, so that's a great statement about freedom of speech by John Stuart Mill. Okay, and he continues about open debate. You can never truly call yourself educated unless you study not only the best arguments of your own side, but the best arguments of your opponents. So in this, I see sort of a Greek influence. He studied Greek since he was 3 years old. He said he can't even remember not knowing how to speak and read Greek. All right, so what I'm basically saying here is, I like all this freedom of speech, open debate, sort of the Athenian ideas. But he also will later take on what one might call the Darwinian ideas of his time. And these are also comes from his father, was friends with Jeremy Bentham, and then you get into the whole utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, and that leads to places where one really doesn't want to go. So here's how Mill starts getting down this path. Put away your Bibles. God has not spoken. God has no business in moral matters. People decide what is right or wrong. Take a survey. Talk to people. Whatever gives them maximum pleasure is moral. Whatever gives maximum pain is immoral. It's not like I left religion. I never had one to begin with. Now I don't care. And my views on science, politics, philosophy, ethics, or whatever should not be tainted by religious beliefs. Every position I take should be utilitarian, including freedom. The greatest good for the greatest number, John Stuart Mill. Okay, now I'm going to show some counter statements by Ayn Rand. And again, Ayn Rand, go ahead, hate her if you want, call her a bitch, say whatever you want about her. She's a genius, and she's very good at getting right to the crux of what somebody's saying and fixing it properly. So here's what Ayn Rand has to say about John Stuart Mill and his utilitarianism. The greatest good for the greatest number, utilitarianism, is one of the most vicious slogans ever foisted on humanity. If you consider this moral, you would have to approve the following example. 9 hungry cannibals eating the 10th. Ayn Rand. She's exactly correct. Whenever you get into this greatest good for the greatest number, you just have the majority gangs up on the minority, and that gives them the right to do anything they want to the minority. There is no God. There are no natural rights in that context. So Ayn Rand continues. The common good becomes a moral blank check for those who claim to embody it. It means that the good of some men takes precedence over the good of others, and those others are consigned to the status of sacrificial animals. She's exactly right. So this is what happens when somebody starts talking about the greatest good. Basically, they claim that they're superior. The person they don't like, or their opponent, they claim is inferior, and they abuse the other person. And if you go by Darwinian policy or utilitarianism or English imperialism, they are completely in the right to do so. Atheists are a minority compared to religious people, but by utilitarian principles, he even cancels his own argument. They shouldn't be able to boss around the majority who are religious, okay? And so we'll see where that's leading to. Okay, so we're finishing up here. And this is really, I think, the best part of this discussion of Mill, because it cuts to the chase of what happens in real life. Solomon Asch was a PhD psychologist, and he showed that the average person is really very weak mentally, and they will conform to whatever the group says. They know it's not true, but they want to agree with the group, they want to get along with the group, and they literally will answer things and say things that they know are completely untrue to go along with the group. So like we said, humans not only have herbivore physiology, they also have herbivore mentality. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of bad behavior. For example, if the majority of men want to stone a woman for adultery, Most men would go along with it, but is that the right thing to do? Utilitarians do not believe in natural rights. Natural rights comes from the idea that humans are created in the image of God. Therefore, there's something godlike about them, something divine about them. Therefore, they deserve to be treated with special rights, not granted to an animal. But once you throw that out the door and you say there is, nothing but Darwinism, then they're just a talking primate. They have zero rights, none. Okay? So John Stuart Mill wanted freedom of speech and thought for Englishmen, but he did not believe in freedom of thought and speech for people of India or people of Ireland. Mill worked for the East India Company from 1823 to 1858, and he supported the control of the people of India by Britain. He said it was good for them, the people of India, to be controlled by Britain. And an example of utilitarian, atheist, imperialistic British philosophy contributed to the Orissa Bengal famine of 1866, where millions have died. Okay, and then the British would just use Darwinian, Malthusian rationality. They'll say, well, it's Malthusian. That's what happens in the natural world. It's Darwinian, survival of the fittest. They're inferior. They starve to death. Okay, that was the mentality of the British in the 1800s. And he could have left the East India Company. He could have done something to try to help the people of India. And I also mention this because my own background, my father's from Ireland, okay? And I learned a lot from talking to these old Irish guys when I was young. And I found out that my father's family had two last names. So they had an Irish name, like from the Gaelic, McCrory, which meant son of a red-haired king, probably son of a red-haired chieftain. But the British gave them a different name. And the British name is, so McCrory, son of the red-haired king, son of the red-haired chieftain. But they gave them the name Rogers, which is related to the French. French had tremendous influence on the British because, the conquest of 1066. And Rogers really comes from rouge, the color red, from French, which means the red ones. So it's a degradation name, like a slave name, if you will. My great uncle was shot by the British, so I'm pretty familiar with that in the family history. My grandfather was also shot by the British, so I'm pretty familiar with that in the history. And I think that's why Americans are so pathetically ignorant of history, because they've grown up sort of in this protected, simpleton type country where they don't know anything about history. I mean, if you want to be able to make intelligent comparisons, you have to know about the ancient Greeks. You have to know about the ancient Romans. You really need to know something about the Renaissance, something about the Enlightenment, the Victorian age, and then the modern age. You have historical perspective because these patterns of events, they repeat themselves over and over. Okay, and then, for example, I learned these stories about the British would not let an Irishman own a horse. Lots of jobs were blocked to them. Education was blocked to them. They used to go to the hedgerow schools. They couldn't even go to a regular school. They'd have to have their own private meetings to get educated. And they called them the hedgerows, just out in the fields to try to learn something. For example, in the early 1600s, and actually in the 1500s, when Queen Elizabeth was the Queen of England, and they wanted to crush the Irish, she said, hang all the harp players wherever they are found and destroy their instruments, because they saw the harp players as carrying the Irish traditions. And the harp, that's why the harp is so popular with the Irish. It's on their flag, it's on their coins, because it's sort of part of what kept them alive, all right? The Irish musicians were seen as the keepers of the Gaelic Irish tradition. Okay, and so now what does this have to do with John Stuart Mill? Well, John Stuart Mill was in Parliament, and when the Irish underwent their famine, John Stuart Mill spoke up to basically say, screw the Irish. He said, for the relief of Ireland, all we ever hear, we are asked to give, give, give. We protest with all our force against giving one additional farthing. The Irish will be exactly as they were before. We must give over telling the Irish that it is our business to find food for them. We must tell them, now and forever, it is their business to find their own food. The British basically starved to death millions of Irish people in the 1840s. It's an awful story. You study it, you'll see. Okay, I've studied it pretty closely. And the British wanted as many Irish to die as possible. All right? They lost over half their population. It was awful. All right. Okay, so basically what John Stuart Mill is saying, in effect, is don't help the Irish. They're just lazy. It's sort of like saying they're inferior, they deserve to die. It's very easy for Darwinian. That's why the English favored Darwin so much over Wallace. Wallace was like the co-discoverer of different types of evolutionary theory, because the Darwinian concept of survival of the fittest, as came from Herbert Spencer, supported the idea that Britain was the best people, therefore they had the right to impose imperialism on all the others, and if they all starved to death, so what? We'll just take their land. That was the attitude of the British. Okay, and this wasn't missed by other rulers. Stalin saw what the British had done there. They also did it in the Boer War in the concentration camps. They starved to death over 27,000 of the Boer people. And you know these things historically. You see them. Okay, so Stalin, another atheist Darwinian type who believed in reason. So when they get rid of God, that way they don't have to be obligated to follow any types of morals or natural rights whatsoever towards the people. So Stalin, in the late 1920s, early 1930s, he starved to death millions of Ukrainians. So people should be aware of that. When there is a God-based worldview that says people are created in the image of God, then they have some natural rights. And if they don't have that, they're talking primates. And in a Darwinian view, they're the inferior talking primate, and therefore they deserve to die. So it's important to understand these philosophical and historical things because it helps shape how people are treated. So anyways, I hope that was helpful.